The Great Depression, Module 18, from 1928 to roughly about 1934. So here are your questions to ponder. Right? Could the Great Depression have been avoided? What led to the Great Depression? What did the Great Depression entail or consist of? How does the Dust Bowl serve as a symbol of the Great Depression? How did the Hoover administration approach the Depression? How did the FDR administration approach the Depression? And for this one, it could be answered in our next module, so don't worry about that one just yet. And then how were the effects of the Great Depression felt globally? So let's talk about the economy that we had as the Coolidge administration comes to an end and the Hoover administration begins. If you recall, in the 1920s, we turned to consumerism, right? People are buying. Now, this is more so in the middle of the decade, not so much towards the tail end. And that's what's going to help lead to where we will end up in 1929 and the early 30s. But there's also the credit system, right? That's the whole, okay, you can put a little bit down now, right? And then pay back in installments. There's speculation. There's obviously prosperity going on. And there's that idea of non-intervention and returning to normalcy. Part of that whole reason for returning to normalcy was to cut back on progressive reforms from the previous presidents. And that meant at times getting rid of legislation, right? Or overriding legislation and getting rid of certain referendums and reforms that had been put in place by the federal government at first. Well, now we're starting to see some trouble on the horizon, right? Industries are losing business, such as railroads, for instance. Railroads, we know, have been at the forefront of helping to build the United States into what it's become since the mid-1800s. However, now we have, airplanes, we have cars, we have cheaper modes of transportation and more easily available modes of transportation than trains and railroads can provide at times. And there's no longer a high demand for mining or lumbering, right? During that age of industrialization and during the war effort, we needed to produce a lot. We needed to mine coal, for instance, for energy. And now we have alternative fuels and energy options, right? Water, steam, electricity. These are now playing a role here. And so, when you have competition that's going on, your industry can suffer if it's a more outdated one. Overproduction obviously was a key factor here, right? Farms had grown a lot of crops that they too much to sell. Different industries again had different products that people towards the end of the decade were not looking to buy as much because we don't have equality or parity amongst social classes. And I'll talk a little bit about that, I think, in a few slides. So as a result, companies are forced to lay off workers, and the housing market also finds trouble, right? You can't start up a housing market when people can't afford a house. And also, if you think about all the various factors that go into the house, right? It's the construction of it. It's the sale of it, of course, but it's also, okay, let's see, furniture goes into it, right? Plumbing, electricity. When there's no need for houses because people can't afford them anyway, well, then you don't need the jobs that kind of go towards that, right? And so those are suffering as well. So now we reach the breaking point, right? And the breaking point is seen with the farming industry. They took out a vast amount of loans during World War I to expand their land, expand the technology and machines that they were using, and now they can't pay that back. Because post-war, the demand for food fell. During the war, it was great because, we need to feed the soldiers abroad, right? We need to feed the soldiers. So, hey, the farms can actually jack up their prices and they'll still be utilized. But now you have the number of goods will outweigh the need for them, right? Will outweigh what the consumption level is at. And in turn, farmers will then decide to then just burn their crops, dump their milk, because it's better to lose that than, basically come out in the red, right? Make no profit. In fact, you're losing money on it. And deflation is then a key factor there. You have to lower the price of your goods. It's not doing any favors for these farmers, and because they can't pay back their debt, a lot of farms are foreclosed upon. Rising prices led to less consumption. The credit system will now fail. Again, if you have taken out loans, or if you say, I can pay this back in installments, but now you can't, you are in severe debt, and that's not going to help with anyone. And the uneven distribution of income was also evident. The rich got richer. We know this from the Roaring '20s, the social changes, again, from even Great Gatsby. And the poor got poorer. It does not matter what's happening to that lower class. Everyone thinks, oh, people are fine, they can afford it. No, they can't. When you can barely afford the living wage for a family, you can't buy the goods that people assume you can. You cannot invest when people think you can. In fact, you might be out of a job because of these struggling industries, and that's where we see the disparities coming into play. So we get to Hoover, right? Hoover is our 31st president, all right, 1929 to 1933, one term. He's a Republican president, and he's actually largely considered one of the, not I don't want to say failures, but one of the biggest failures as a president, right? The largest cloud is hanging over him. Sure, he's a humanitarian and a reformist. Sure, if you look at his past political office experience, he does a great amount, right? He's a food administrator for the, USDA. He is a chairman of the Supreme Economic Council, and he's the Secretary of Commerce. He knows what he's doing to some extent, but he also believed in non-intervention, much like Coolidge. He also believed in limited government, and this will come back to bite him during the Depression. He's also known as being the guy who gets the project funded and built with the Hoover Dam, which, as we know, supplies a lot of water and even energy then to the West, right? Currently, Los Angeles and Vegas, for instance, benefit greatly from the Hoover Dam. So Hoover's presidency, right? He wants to overhaul federal regulations. He wants to emphasize the individual responsibility and prosperity that Americans feel. It's not the government's business to get involved. You prosper on your own. You thrive on your own, and in that same vein, you struggle and falter on your own. The government is absolved of any responsibility there, but it's also, he feels no need to have that involvement. Civil service reform is still in full swing, offering jobs to people in government, not through patronage, but through obviously the means of, do you have the qualifications? Are you good enough for the job? He cracks down on organized crime. He creates the Federal Farm Board, which I'll talk about later. He creates the VA. He does a lot of positive things if you think about the beginning of his presidency, and things are going well, but then October hits and we have a crash. Right? September was great. Stock market, that's at an all-time high. And then on October 24th and October 28th of 1929, less than a year after Hoover becomes president, right? He just gets inaugurated that January. Black Tuesday hits. Black Tuesday results in about 14 million stocks getting sold because prices are plummeting. Black Tuesday is even worse, right? That's about 16 million, a little over 16 million. People who had bought stocks at, let's say you bought a share at, $30, you're now struggling to sell it, and you're trying to sell it at, 11, 10, right? You've lost a great amount of your investment there. And in turn, no one else is buying the stocks. And companies are now trying to sell their shares, and no one wants to buy them. So profits are lost across the board. You can go from, we hear rags to riches. No, this is very much riches to rags in a matter of a day, really. That's how quickly things turn around for a lot of people when it comes to the market. So why the crash, right? Consider the previous reasons in the breaking point, right? Consider speculation, consider people aren't buying as much, consider the failing credit system, which we see will fail. Consider the fact that, again, there's a disparity in income. And then add in speculation and buying on margin. These are two critical concepts. Speculation, right? The purchasing of items in hopes of selling later at a higher price. Okay, I'm going to buy, either real estate, right? A plot of land, or I'm going to buy, 20 shares in this company. And, I don't care. I don't care about the risk. It's the risk reward kind of thing. And there's really very little consideration given towards the risk. It's, I will buy this and I will flip it, sell it, whatever, in a matter of months because I can, and the market's going well. What do I have to lose? Furthermore, right, advertisements from the 20s, that helps fuel that speculation and the buying. The fact that others are successful, you're enticed now for that easy profit. And so as prices continue to rise, you continue to buy. And it seems like it's not going to fail, right? Things, again, are going perfectly fine up until late October hits. And in fact, by the way, even though the market crashed late October, the effects really, truly aren't felt as a whole until, November and then into the early 1930. Buying on margin is where you basically put down a small percentage of your own money as payment when it comes to buying stocks. So you can put down 75%. You could put down 35-40%. Depends on how your broker wants to work that deal out with you, and then you borrow the rest from the broker and you pay that back, right? You can pay it back with interest as well. And so, okay, let's say your stock does really well. Well, great. Then you can pay off that loan and you've made a profit. You've turned a profit, a greater profit than you could have. But again, that risk comes into play because it's the stock market and things can crash. So when you buy on margin and then you can't afford to pay back your loan, right, you are now in debt and you lose out a lot. Here's a short video that I want you to watch. All right, this will end up really elaborating more on buying on margin. Here's a short video. Right, some ads, or an ad showing, right, the buy now component, an image of the stock market, right, where people are gathering and buying and trading on the market as the day goes on. Things seem pretty great. Obviously, we'll know that they won't be in the long run or relatively short. So the crash happens, and Hoover's first move is to say, hey, let's sign this tariff. And this is proposed by Representative Hawley and Senator Smoot, who work together and say, here's this tariff, and it's going to be great. In 1930, they're going to pass this highest protective tariff, and it's going to protect American industries, protect American farmers and manufacturers. Perfect, right? All tariffs do this, except it has an adverse effect. When you jack up tariffs, you can't sell your product anymore. And not only that, because there's no centralized currency, amongst countries, right? Foreign countries, if France can't buy American products, France cannot then, have the American capital, the U.S. currency to spend. Okay. Or if France can't sell their products, they can't be paid with American currency to use to buy American goods. And so competitors will then retaliate with their own tariffs. And now we have a tariff war, and instead of helping out business, exports and imports go down significantly. Unemployment will worsen, hardships are worsened as well, and industries struggle to recover. Right? The hardships are because Hoover does very little. Right? The tariff makes matters worse. You have shanty towns come about. Literally, these are very run-down towns and houses for large communities of people. Soup kitchens come about, bread lines come about. Men are waiting in hours just for food, just to get a paper to see if there's any opportunity for jobs. They don't want to initially. I mean, it's all about pride. You don't want to, but they're forced to. And public confidence will drop steadily as hardships begin to be felt in waves. I want you to remember, though, one key thing. And by the way, on the left-hand side, we have possibly the most famous picture from the Depression of a migrant mother. This picture was taken by Dorothea Lange, who took this photo to just really show what the struggle is like for a family. But remember this, and as it says right here, the crash was only part of the Depression. Okay. Yes, the stock market crashes, and that's a huge factor. But when you have such a small percent of the population investing in the stock market, only that population loses a lot through the crash. It's the factors of unemployment that come to play. It feeds into demographics. Okay, who's getting what in terms of benefits? Men are obviously getting a little bit more than women. African Americans during the Depression, 50% of African Americans are unemployed. And yet the entire unemployed population of the US is 25%. No one is saved from this, right? And the effects are felt across the board at different levels. Other images, right? This is a Hooverville, a shanty town. You see the rundown houses and a line of men waiting for free soup, free coffee, free donuts for the unemployed. Furthermore, the Chamber of Commerce had a sign that literally just said, "Jobless men, keep going. We can't take care of our own." Other men would walk around, right, with signs around their neck, looking for jobs. They're family men. They're decent men, right? They're veterans. Can we get a job? Can you help us? People are doing whatever they can and whatever they need to get a job here. So we get to the Dust Bowl, and the Dust Bowl was a key factor as well of the Great Depression. Primarily in the Great Plains, it comes about due to a drought in the 30s, right? A lot of farmers had land, and they were thriving in the Midwest at first. But when windstorms gather and scatter dust and topsoil throughout the region, the land is lost. Profits are lost. Livelihoods are lost. And this is in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, right? That general area. And I think we can all envision that right now on the map, or look at a map and you'll see it. So the question for a lot of these farmers becomes, do we cultivate this land, right? Attempt to cultivate this unproductive land, or do we move on? And a lot of them chose to move on, right? A lot of them chose to migrate west, and that just added to more problems, right? These American migrants were looked down upon, and it does not help. They find very little job opportunity. Others then decide to just go back east, right? Maybe they could find something there. But there's not a lot of opportunity now because these farms are run down. These farms are essentially blown away. John Steinbeck writes the book The Grapes of Wrath in 1939 to depict hardships in the Great Depression, and a description of Okies, which are people from Oklahoma, but migrants, right? This is the term used for migrants. The hardships that they felt moving west, trying to save whatever they could and find a better livelihood. So Hoover failed big time, right? He believed that the economy was on sound footing and that any lack of confidence in the economic future is foolish. He urged people to remain optimistic, and yet this wasn't all that productive. All right, his thing was individualism, if you remember, right? It's less government intervention. It's not playing a limited role, and there is very little federal relief. People everywhere during the Great Depression are experiencing a variety of hardships. Again, men struggling to find jobs. Women barely have anything anyway, and they're afraid to even admit that they need help. right? Minorities, African Americans, immigrants, right? If you think they had troubles earlier, no, this is where a lot of these troubles come about, because who are you going to give preference to when it comes to being American? And furthermore, you know, thousands of children would either be abandoned by their families or would leave, right? There would be children who would say, okay, well, if I leave my family behind, that's one less mouth to feed, right? They would do it out of the benefit of trying to help their parents. So lots of different experiences lend themselves to what's going on post and during the Depression. And eventually it takes a toll mentally. Suicides are on the rise. Again, people can't find jobs, stable jobs, or any sort of footing, and the market has crashed. And now we have everyone scrambling to figure out what they're going to do. And so Hoover, right, he wants that limited role. He believes in individualism, and that's fine, but eventually people start to turn on this. They start to turn on Hoover for these failures. And that's because there's no federal relief. He thinks that, okay, cool, we can leave it up to the states, we can leave it up to industries and institutions, right? Leave it to them. Let's cooperate, not compete. And let's make it voluntary cooperation. Let the government just facilitate. Let's be cautious, and yet that's ineffective. And that's where we get Hoovervilles coming about too. Right? Hoovervilles are the terms that are given to these shanty towns. Eventually, he does take action. Right? He encourages cooperation. He negotiates agreements. This is like as far as he will go with the federal government. He creates the Federal Farm Board, which agrees to say, okay, we're going to raise crop prices. Then we're going to buy the crops as the board, and we're going to keep the crops off the market until prices as a whole will rise. So once prices rise, then they will be sold, and then the farmer will make the profit. He also says, let's give loans to small banks. Two big things that he brings about in his administration are the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which allows you to lower your mortgage rates and refinance your farm loans, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which authorizes $2 billion for emergency financing. And this will go largely to corporations, but his belief is that, look, with the $2 billion, once it gets used up at the top, it will trickle down to the average citizen. But for many average citizens, average Americans, it was, not feasible, right? There was the belief that, no, the government's just helping out corporations. And that's what this political cartoon, depicts: utilities, railroads, big corporations, industry being helped out, while the rest of us are in the back, while the rest of us don't get the benefits of recovery. And so public opinion really does sway against Hoover. Democrats have taken the House as well, which is motivated largely because of anti-Hoover sentiment and anti-Republican sentiment due to what he did or didn't do. And ultimately, his actions are just a little too little, too late. Finally, there's the Bonus Army. And the Bonus Army consisted of World War I veterans. About 10 to 20,000 of them marched on Washington along with their families. And they came to support this bill called the Patman Bill. And this bill said, hey, we're going to give the bonus compensation to those veterans because we feel that they were not adequately paid for their service. And we're going to push the pay date up from 1945 to now. About $500 a soldier. And I think it'd be good, though, that was pushed up, because if you think about it, 1945 is right around the end of World War II. Imagine what that would have done to the bonuses. Well, the legislation gets struck down. Hoover also calls these veterans communists and criminals. He opposes legislation but respects their right to assemble, so he allows them to stay until the legislation is decided on, and when it fails, he moves to disband them. And he calls on these two guys, Douglas MacArthur and Dwight Eisenhower, to go out with 1,000 soldiers and literally, push these people out of DC, away from the Capitol, using violence if needed. And they do. Now, ultimately, this will spark, well, two things. One, it will spark the fact that the GI Bill, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, will now be considered upon and later voted into legislation. And two, this is Hoover's biggest downfall, right? Every single folly and his failure to act during the Depression ultimately leads to this bonus Army March, where he then acts against the soldiers and will officially open the door for FDR. Once again, I leave you these questions to ponder, right? Hopefully, you can think back on them and answer the questions thoroughly.